The red tag went up on a Tuesday morning in October, stapled to the oak-paneled front door of a 7,400 square foot mansion in the gated community of Sterling Oaks, North Carolina. It read, in the flat bureaucratic language that carries more weight than any curse word ever could, notice of unsafe structure, occupancy prohibited, by order of the Millstone County Building Standards Division. Renata Voss stood on her own front steps in her robe, phone in hand, watching a county inspector named Neil Ashworth photograph the hairline fractures spidering up her foyer's marble columns, cracks she'd been told for 2 years were just settling. 2 moving trucks were already parked in the circular driveway, not for her belongings. For the temporary displacement crew the county sends when a home is condemned as unsafe for habitation. 61 miles away, in a house with a new roof, a repaired foundation, and a fresh coat of navy blue paint, Mara Kessler sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee, reading the county's public notice online with the calm of a woman who had known this exact moment was coming for the better part of a year. She did not smile. She simply closed the laptop and went back to work. To understand how a woman's crumbling 2-bedroom bungalow ended up outlasting her sister's mansion, you have to go back 9 years, to a family that believed appearances were the only currency that mattered, and to the one daughter they never bothered to actually look at. Mara Kessler was 34 years old, and for most of her adult life, she had been the quiet disappointment at every Kessler family gathering. She'd grown up in Ashfield Corners, a modest town 40 minutes outside Charlotte, the older of 2 daughters, born to Harold and Denise Kessler. Harold sold commercial insurance policies for 30 years and retired with a pension he liked to describe as modest but respectable, a phrase he used constantly, usually right before pointing out that someone else's success was neither modest nor respectable enough to be trusted. Denise ran the social calendar of the family with the precision of a general. Birthdays, holidays, church potlucks, the annual Kessler Christmas photo that had to be retaken 3 times because someone's smile wasn't convincing enough. In that household, love was distributed like a limited resource, rationed out based on performance, and Mara had learned early that she was not the daughter who performed well. That distinction belonged to her younger sister, Renata. Renata was luminous in the way that photographs well, always laughing at the right moment, always dressed like she'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine, always saying the thing that made Harold's chest puff out with pride. Where Mara was steady and quiet and precise, Renata was effortless and dazzling and adored. It wasn't that Mara resented her sister for this. She'd made peace with it decades ago, the way you make peace with weather. What she never made peace with was what it cost her. Mara had built her adult life carefully and without fanfare. She'd gone to North Carolina State on a partial engineering scholarship, worked 2 jobs to cover the rest, and graduated with a degree in civil engineering, later earning her professional engineer license, the credential that legally allowed her to stamp structural drawings, testify in litigation, and certify that a building was safe to stand in. She'd spent 6 years doing structural forensic work for an insurance-adjacent firm called Corbett Meridian Group, investigating why buildings failed. Foundations that heaved, roofs that collapsed under snow load they were never rated for, framing that had been quietly substituted with cheaper lumber than the blueprints called for. It was meticulous, unglamorous work, and Mara loved it precisely because it rewarded patience and precision over charisma. She never talked about it at family dinners, not because she was ashamed, but because she'd learned that whenever she mentioned anything related to her career, her mother's eyes would glaze over within 4 seconds and drift toward whatever new development was happening in Renata's life. So Mara simply stopped bringing it up. As far as Harold and Denise Kessler understood, their older daughter did something with buildings. Inspections, maybe? Not real money in that. They had no idea their daughter's signature carried legal weight in a courtroom. They had no idea how much she actually made. They had no idea, frankly, how little they knew about her at all. In 2016, at 26, Mara bought a small three-bedroom bungalow on Larkspur Lane in Ashfield Corners for $98,400, a fixer-upper with good bones and a leaking roof, purchased specifically because she understood exactly what was wrong with it and exactly what it would cost to fix. Her plan was simple: live in it modestly for a few years, renovate it in phases as she saved, and eventually turn it into the kind of home she actually wanted. It was, by any working professional's standard, a smart and disciplined plan. It also became, over the following 8 years, the single most reliable punchline at every Kessler family gathering. The truth of what happened to that renovation plan begins with a man named Elias Kessler, Harold's father, Mara and Renata's grandfather, who died in March of 2015 after 4 decades running a modestly successful chain of hardware stores across 3 counties. Elias had never been flashy, but he'd been careful, and when he died, his estate settled into a trust worth $840,000, split evenly between his 2 granddaughters, to be held and administered by Harold as trustee until each granddaughter reached the age of 30, or married, whichever came first. The trust document, drafted by Elias's longtime attorney, a meticulous man named Walter Ostrowski, was explicit on one point above all others. Each granddaughter's share belonged to her alone, to be released to her individually and in full, and the trustee held no discretion to redirect, combine, or reallocate funds between the 2 beneficiaries under any circumstance. Renata married Bradley Voss in June of 2018, at 28, in a wedding that cost more than most people's first homes. Her marriage triggered her disbursement under the trust's terms, and $420,000 moved into her name within weeks. Mara, meanwhile, was still 4 years from 30 and unmarried, meaning her half sat untouched in trust, administered by her father, waiting for the year she'd turn 30 in 2020. That year came, and went, and the money never appeared. Every time Mara asked, gently at first, then more directly, Harold offered a rotating set of excuses. The trust was still settling some paperwork issues with Ostrowski's office. There was a hold on distributions related to some vague tax matter. The market was not a good time to liquidate the investment accounts the trust held. Each excuse was plausible enough on its own to survive a single conversation, and Mara, who trusted her father, because that is what daughters are conditioned to do, let each one go. Meanwhile, without the funds she'd budgeted around, her renovation plan for the bungalow on Larkspur Lane stalled indefinitely. The roof she'd meant to replace in 2021 kept getting patched instead. The foundation crack in the north corner, which she monitored carefully with hairline gauges, a professional habit, widened slowly over 3 years because she couldn't justify the underpinning cost on her salary alone, while still waiting on money that was, by law, already hers. And across town, over those same years, Sterling Oaks rose out of the ground. Before we get into how this story ends, tell me where you're watching from right now. Drop your city in the comments. And tell me something else. Have you ever had to get even with someone who was supposed to love you? I want to know. Renata and Bradley broke ground on their custom home in the gated Sterling Oaks development in the spring of 2019, less than a year after her trust disbursement. The build was ambitious from the start: 7 bedrooms, a home theater, a wine cellar, a saltwater pool with a vanishing edge, custom stonework imported from a quarry in Georgia. Renata posted every phase of construction to her 22,000 social media followers under the caption, "Building Our Forever Home," and Denise reposted every single one, sometimes with captions like, "So proud of the life my girls are building," a phrase that, notably, only ever seemed to apply to one girl. The contractor Renata and Bradley hired was a man named Lyle Draper, owner of Draper Custom Builds, a firm with a growing reputation in the region for delivering elaborate homes fast and under budget. A reputation, it would later become clear, built substantially on cutting corners no homeowner would ever notice until it was too late. Draper's crews poured the foundation in June of 2019, on soil that Millstone County's own geological survey had flagged years earlier as high-expansion clay requiring specific pier depths and moisture barriers to prevent long-term settling. Draper's foundation plan called for standard footings at a depth of 36 inches. The engineer of record who stamped the plans, a man named Preston Yates, who did the bulk of his business through referrals from Draper himself, signed off on the shallower depth without requesting the soil compaction testing the county code technically required, testing that would have added roughly $14,000 and 6 weeks to the project timeline. Numbers Draper considered bad for his growing reputation as the contractor who gets it done. Meanwhile, the family narrative around the two sisters calcified into something Mara heard recited, almost word for word, at every holiday for 6 years running. At Thanksgiving in 2021, Harold raised his wine glass and toasted the success in this family, gesturing pointedly toward Renata's end of the table, before adding, with a chuckle he clearly thought was affectionate, "And Mara's doing her thing too, I guess. Still in that little house, right? When's the roof finally getting done, honey?" The table laughed. Mara smiled, because that was what you did, and said nothing about the fact that the roof wasn't getting done because the money that was legally hers had somehow never arrived. At Christmas in 2022, Denise took a photo tour of Sterling Oaks for the extended family group chat. The theater room, the wine cellar, Renata's walk-in closet the size of Mara's actual bedroom, and captioned it, "This is what it looks like when hard work pays off." Mara's aunt asked, in the group chat, whether Mara was doing okay in that older house of hers, and Denise replied, "Oh, Mara's fine. She just doesn't prioritize things the way Renata does." Mara read that message sitting on her living room floor, a bucket beneath a fresh ceiling leak 6 inches from her feet, and said nothing. By 2023, the running joke had a name. The family had started calling Mara's house the Shack, casually, affectionately, the way you'd nickname anything you'd decided wasn't worth taking seriously. At her 33rd birthday dinner, Bradley made a joke about how Mara should let Renata's contractor take a look at that place sometime, might scare him off for life. Renata laughed so hard she had to put her wine glass down. Harold laughed too. Denise laughed loudest of all. Mara laughed along with them, every time. What none of them understood, what none of them had ever bothered to ask, was that the woman they were mocking for living in a house with a leaking roof held a license that legally certified whether buildings were structurally sound enough to occupy. She had spent 6 years walking through the wreckage of homes that failed exactly the way theirs was, quietly, invisibly beginning to fail. She knew, better than any of them, what a poorly compacted foundation on expansive clay soil looked like in year 1, year 3, year 5. And she had started noticing things in Renata's social media photos that made her stomach tighten in a way she didn't yet let herself fully name. The first crack appeared in a photograph in the fall of 2022. A hairline fracture running diagonally through the stucco above the mansion's 3-car garage, visible in the corner of a photo Renata had posted showcasing her new Range Rover. Mara zoomed in without meaning to, professional instinct taking over before conscious thought caught up, and recognized the pattern immediately. Diagonal shear cracking consistent with differential settlement. She told herself it was probably cosmetic. She told herself it wasn't her business. She told herself a lot of things. For a long time, because the alternative, actually investigating, would have required confronting a truth about her family she wasn't yet ready to hold. The wrong Mara had been living inside for years, finally had a shape, a name, and a paper trail, and it started, as these things always do, with a piece of mail that was never supposed to reach her. In February of 2024, Denise accidentally forwarded Mara an email meant for Renata, a monthly statement from Coastal Trust and Fiduciary Services, the institution managing what remained of Elias Kessler's estate accounts. Denise had clearly meant to hit forward to her younger daughter and hit the wrong contact in a hurry. Mara almost deleted it without opening the attachment. Almost. Professional instinct. The same instinct that had made her zoom in on a stucco crack 2 years earlier made her open the PDF instead. The statement was a full account history going back to 2019. And there, on page 4, was a line item Mara read 4 times before her brain would accept it, a disbursement dated March 14, 2019, for $192,000, drawn from beneficiary B. M. Kessler allocation, transferred to beneficiary A. R. Voss, Construction Escrow, Sterling Oaks Build, authorized by a document titled Trust Amendment and Beneficiary Waiver, signed by both trustee, Harold Kessler, and beneficiary, Mara Kessler. Mara had never signed any such document. She had never seen it. She had never waived anything. She sat with that statement open on her laptop for 11 minutes without moving, the way you sit very still after you've been hit by something and are waiting to find out how badly. Then she did what 6 years of forensic training had taught her to do with any anomaly. She stopped reacting, and she started documenting. Over the following weeks, working quietly and telling no one, Mara requested, under North Carolina's Trust Beneficiary Statute, which entitles a beneficiary to a full accounting of trust activity upon written request, a complete transaction history from Coastal Trust and Fiduciary Services. It took 6 weeks and 2 follow-up letters, but the full accounting arrived in April, and it confirmed what the single statement had suggested. Between March 2019 and September 2020, 3 separate transfers totaling $192,000 had been drawn from Mara's untouched trust allocation and redirected into an escrow account tied to the Sterling Oaks construction project, each one authorized by a version of the same amendment document, each one bearing a signature reading Mara E. Kessler, that Mara had never written. She had the document examined by a certified forensic document analyst named Priya Chandran, not yet as her attorney, but as an independent verification step, because Mara understood that feelings were not evidence, and evidence was the only thing that would ever matter in what came next. Chandran's report, delivered in May 2024, was unambiguous. The signatures on all 3 amendment documents showed inconsistent letter formation, unnatural pen lifts, and stroke patterns inconsistent with Mara's known signature exemplars, all consistent with traced or freehand forgery. The notary stamp on each document belonged to a woman named Carla Jennings, a family friend from the Kesslers' church, who, when Chandran's investigator quietly and lawfully inquired under the pretext of a routine title search, could not produce any notary journal entry for the dates in question, as North Carolina law requires. There was no record she had ever witnessed Mara sign anything, because she hadn't. That was the moment the wrong stopped being a suspicion and became a fact. Her parents had stolen $192,000 that belonged to her under the law, forged her signature to cover it, and used a family friend's notary stamp to make the theft look legitimate, all so that her sister's mansion could be 7 bedrooms instead of 6, so that the wine cellar could be finished, so that the Vanishing Edge pool could exist at all. And every single year since, at every dinner table, they had mocked the daughter they'd stolen from, for not being able to afford the roof the theft had made impossible to fix. After learning what Harold and Denise Kessler did to their own daughter, forging her signature to steal money that was legally hers, on a scale of 1 to 10, how angry are you right now? Drop your number in the comments, because it is about to get a great deal more satisfying. Mara did not confront her parents that week, or that month. She had learned something in 6 years of forensic work that most people never learn in a lifetime. The moment you reveal what you know, you lose the ability to gather anything further. Confrontation feels like justice in the moment, but it is, functionally, a fire alarm. It tells everyone in the building to start hiding things immediately. So instead, on a Sunday afternoon in late May, sitting at her kitchen table with the forged documents printed and organized in a manila folder in front of her, Mara made a decision that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with arithmetic. She was owed $192,000, plus whatever interest and penalties the law allowed for breach of fiduciary duty. She had documentation of forgery. She had photographic evidence, going back 2 years, of structural distress in a home built partly with her stolen money. And she had something her family had never once considered in 8 years of mockery. She had the professional license, the training, and the patience to make sure that when this came apart, it came apart completely, legally, and irreversibly. She closed the folder, made herself a cup of coffee, and began, for the first time in her life, to build something just for herself. Something shifted in Mara that Sunday afternoon. Quiet as it was, she'd stopped being the daughter who let things go, and started becoming the woman who was about to take everything back. Have you ever had that exact moment, where you stopped being the bigger person and started planning instead? Tell me about it in the comments. The plan Mara built over the following 7 months was not dramatic. It did not involve a single raised voice, a single confrontation, or a single moment where she tipped her hand before she was ready. It was built the way she built everything, one verified fact at a time, stacked carefully on top of the last, until the structure it formed could not be knocked down by anyone. The first thing she did was retain Priya Chandran's colleague, an attorney named Denise Okafor at a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, specializing in trust and fiduciary litigation, chosen specifically because Okafor had no personal or social connection to the Kessler family and could not be quietly talked out of anything at a barbecue. Mara laid out the entire timeline for Okafor across a 2-hour meeting in June. The trust terms, the forged amendment documents, the forensic handwriting analysis, the notary discrepancy, the full accounting from Coastal Trust and Fiduciary. Okafor reviewed it all and told her plainly that this was, on its face, one of the cleanest breach of fiduciary duty cases she'd seen in years, because Harold's paper trail was so sloppy. He had clearly never imagined his daughter would ever request a formal accounting, let alone have it professionally examined. Okafor's advice was strategic and specific. Do not file immediately. Build a complete evidentiary record first, because once litigation started, the discovery process would be adversarial, and Harold would have every incentive to claim confusion, memory lapse, or innocent administrative error. A civil suit built on a thin record could be dragged out for years and settled for pennies. A civil suit built on an airtight one would collapse the moment it was filed. So they built the airtight one. Through Okafor's office, Mara issued a formal, attorney-drafted demand letter to Coastal Trust and Fiduciary Services, requesting preservation of all records related to the trust, including internal correspondence, wire transfer authorizations, and any communications between the institution and Harold Kessler as trustee. A standard legal preservation notice that, crucially, the trust company was obligated to comply with, and that created a permanent record preventing anyone from later claiming documents had simply been lost. The trust company's compliance department, wary of institutional liability, responded within 10 business days with a complete internal file, including something neither Mara nor Okafor had anticipated. An internal email, dated February 2019, from a junior trust officer named Diane Marsh to her supervisor, flagging that the amendment document submitted for the March disbursement doesn't match the notarization format we usually see from this beneficiary's file. Recommend verbal confirmation with Kessler before processing. The supervisor's one-line reply, preserved in the same thread, read, "Client relationship is long-standing. Trustee has full authority per trust terms. Proceed." That email alone would later prove devastating. It demonstrated that a compliance employee had actually raised the exact red flag that should have stopped the fraud, and had been overruled. While the legal record was being built, Mara turned her attention to the second track of her plan, the structural one. This was the part of the case that required no attorney, only her own professional expertise, because she understood something her parents never had. Money stolen and spent is not automatically money lost forever, if the thing it was spent on can be shown, independently, to be worthless. Mara began, quietly and entirely through public and professional channels, to build a structural case file on Sterling Oaks. She started with Millstone County's public property records, which are open to any licensed engineer or member of the public under the state's public records statute. She pulled the original building permit for the Voss residence, permit #MC 2019-04471, issued to Draper Custom Builds in May 2019, and cross-referenced it against the county's geological hazard overlay maps, which she already knew, from professional familiarity with the region, flagged the entire Sterling Oaks development as sitting on Zone 3 expansive clay soil, requiring enhanced foundation specifications under the 2018 County Building Code Amendment. She then pulled the stamped structural drawings on file, which showed standard 36-inch footings, with no soil compaction testing report attached, a glaring omission that, under the code amendment, should have triggered an automatic plan review kickback. It hadn't. She found, buried in the county's digital permit history, a note from the original plan reviewer, a since-retired employee named Gordon Petrie, approving the plans per applicant assurance of compliant soil prep, an assurance, it turned out, that was never actually verified, because Petrie had approved 11 other Draper Custom Builds projects that same year, using the identical boilerplate language, a pattern Mara found faintly nauseating in its laziness. Next, Mara requested the final inspection and certificate of occupancy records for the Voss residence. Public documents, easily obtained. The certificate of occupancy had been issued in November 2020, signed off by a county inspector named Roy Faulkner. What made Mara's pulse quicken was a detail she recognized instantly from her own professional world. State disciplinary records, also public, showed that Roy Faulkner had been terminated from Millstone County's Building Standards Division in 2022, following an unrelated internal investigation into inspection fraud on 3 separate residential projects, where he'd been found to have signed off on final inspections without ever visiting the properties, in exchange for what the disciplinary report vaguely described as undisclosed considerations from a contractor whose name had been redacted in the public version of the file. Mara didn't yet know if Sterling Oaks was one of the 3 projects named in that investigation, but she knew exactly how to find out. Mara is building something very specific here, piece by piece, and she hasn't tipped her hand to a single member of her family. Do you see where this is going yet? Drop your prediction in the comments before the plan finishes unfolding. Through a Public Records Act request filed directly with Millstone County, the kind of request any citizen is legally entitled to file, requiring no explanation of purpose, Mara obtained the full, unredacted internal disciplinary file on Roy Faulkner. Buried on page 19 of the report was exactly what she suspected. The Voss residence at 4 Sterling Oaks Court was one of 3 properties named in the original complaint against Faulkner, flagged by a whistleblowing junior inspector who'd noted that Faulkner's final sign-off inspection was logged at 7:42 a.m. on a Tuesday in November 2020. A timestamp that placed him, according to his own GPS-logged county vehicle records obtained in the same disciplinary investigation, 31 miles away, at a different job site, at the exact moment he supposedly walked through and certified the Voss home as structurally sound and safe for occupancy. The certificate of occupancy for her sister's 7,400-square-foot mansion, the house her parents had stolen $192,000 to help build, the house they'd mocked her crumbling roof in comparison to for 6 straight years, had been signed by a man who was never there. Mara now had 3 independent, professionally documented failures stacked on top of each other, a foundation built without required soil testing on known high-risk clay, a plan review approved on an unverified assurance rather than actual compliance, and a final occupancy certificate signed by an inspector later fired for fraudulently certifying homes he'd never inspected. Any one of these, on its own, might have been dismissed as bureaucratic sloppiness. Together, stacked with dates and signatures and GPS logs that all corroborated each other, they formed something undeniable. Sterling Oaks Court was, in all likelihood, structurally unsound, and its occupancy certificate was fraudulent from the day it was issued. She still said nothing to a single member of her family. Instead, she spent the summer doing something that required more patience than anything else in the plan. She waited, and she watched, documenting the visible deterioration of the mansion the same way she'd have documented any structural failure case for a client, methodically, dispassionately, with dates attached to everything. Every family gathering that summer gave her fresh material without her ever having to ask a single question. At a 4th of July barbecue at Sterling Oaks, Mara photographed, with her phone held casually at hip height, a diagonal crack that had spread across nearly the full width of the dining room's coffered ceiling, directly above the head of the table where her father sat carving a brisket and telling a story about how some people just don't know how to manage money. A comment aimed, as most comments at that table were, gently but unmistakably in her direction. In August, at Renata's birthday dinner, Mara noticed the front door no longer closed flush with its frame, a telltale sign of foundation movement pulling the frame out of square. She filed that observation away too. In September, walking the perimeter of the property under the pretense of admiring the landscaping, she found a 2-inch gap that had opened between the exterior chimney stack and the main structure. A classic differential settlement signature, the chimney sinking at a different rate than the house around it because its footing had been poured to a different, shallower spec than the code required. By October, Mara had what she needed: a complete, chronologically documented, professionally authenticated case that the home her sister had spent 5 years bragging about was quietly and measurably failing, built on a fraudulent inspection record, financed in part by money stolen from her, and that every visible symptom of that failure, every crack, every misaligned door, every gap in the masonry, had been mocked, at various points over the years, as evidence of nothing at all. There was one more piece Mara needed before she moved, and it took longer to secure than everything else combined: a former Draper Custom Builds employee willing to speak on the record. She found him through a professional connection at Corbett Meridian Group, a framing subcontractor named Curtis Boyle, who had worked the Sterling Oaks job in 2019 and had since left the industry entirely after a falling out with Lyle Draper over unpaid invoices. Boyle, when Mara reached out through Okafor's office with a formal, attorney-mediated request rather than approaching him personally, agreed to give a sworn statement. In it, he described watching Draper's site foreman instruct the concrete crew to skip the soil compaction step entirely on the Voss build, telling them, "Draper says we're 2 weeks behind, just pour it, Yates will sign whatever." Boyle further stated that this was standard practice on at least 4 other Draper builds he'd worked that year, and that he'd raised the issue verbally with Draper directly and been told, in Draper's own words, that nobody ever finds out until the house is 20 years old, and by then it's not our problem. With Boyle's sworn statement, Curtis's testimony, the forensic handwriting analysis, the trust company's internal emails, the county permit history, Faulkner's disciplinary file, and 18 months of dated photographic documentation of Sterling Oaks' structural decline, Mara and Okafor finalized 2 simultaneous filings in early November 2024. The first was a civil complaint filed in Millstone County Superior Court against Harold Kessler individually, in his capacity as trustee, alleging breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and conversion, seeking recovery of the $192,000 principal, plus statutory interest, punitive damages, and attorney's fees, a filing that, under North Carolina law, would become part of the public court record the moment it was submitted. The second was a formal complaint filed with the Millstone County Building Standards Division, requesting an emergency structural safety reinspection of the Voss residence, citing the documented history of soil non-compliance, the fraudulent original occupancy certification tied to a previously disciplined inspector, and Mara's own attached professional engineering assessment of the visible distress patterns she'd documented over 18 months, a complaint that, filed by a licensed PE with standing evidence, the county was statutorily obligated to investigate within 30 days. Mara filed both on the same Monday morning in November, at 9:14 a.m., from Okafor's office, and then went to work like it was any other day. The execution phase, once the filings were live, moved with a speed that surprised even Mara, not because the events themselves were dramatic, but because of how quickly a structure built on years of quiet lies collapses once someone finally applies real weight to it. The civil complaint was served on Harold Kessler on a Thursday afternoon in mid-November, delivered by a process server at his home while Denise watched from the front window. Harold called Mara 4 times within the hour. She did not answer. He left a voicemail that began with confusion. "Mara, honey, there's clearly been some kind of mistake. This paperwork doesn't make any sense." And ended, by the 4th message, with something closer to panic, his voice cracking as he said, "You need to call me back right now. This is a family matter. We can figure this out without lawyers." Mara listened to all 4 voicemails once, that evening, sitting on her back porch, and then she did what she'd trained herself to do throughout the entire process. She documented the timestamp of each call for the record, and she let her attorney handle every subsequent communication from that point forward. The building complaint moved on its own separate statutory timeline. Within 11 days, Neil Ashworth, a senior inspector with the Millstone County Building Standards Division, a 19-year veteran of the department who had, notably, been the one to originally flag concerns about Roy Faulkner 2 years earlier, was assigned to conduct the emergency reinspection Mara had requested. Ashworth arrived at Sterling Oaks Court on a Tuesday morning in late November with a structural engineer contracted by the county and a full inspection kit. And Renata, according to what Mara later learned through the public inspection report, met them at the door confused and increasingly agitated, insisting there had been some sort of clerical mix-up, that their home had passed inspection 4 years earlier, that this had to be a mistake. It was not a mistake. Ashworth's team spent 6 hours on the property. They found differential foundation settlement measuring up to 2 3/4 inches across the structure's east wing, well beyond any tolerance the code allowed. They found the chimney separation Mara had photographed months earlier, now widened to nearly 3 inches. They found evidence, through a ground-penetrating radar scan the county engineer brought, specifically because of the soil testing gap flagged in Mara's complaint, that the original foundation piers had never been compacted to the depth the 2018 code amendment required, precisely as Curtis Boyle's sworn statement had described. And cross-referencing the property against Faulkner's disciplinary file, which was now a matter of public record thanks to Mara's earlier request, Ashworth's report noted plainly that the original 2020 certificate of occupancy cannot be relied upon as evidence of code-compliant construction, given the documented fraudulent inspection practices of the certifying inspector. The red tag went up the following Tuesday. Occupancy prohibited, effective immediately, until full structural remediation could be certified by an independent licensed engineer. Remediation the county's own engineer estimated, in the written report, at somewhere between $380,000 and $460,000, given the scope of foundation underpinning required, across nearly the entire structure. Bradley and Renata Voss had 11 days to vacate a home they had lived in for 4 years and had, just weeks earlier, still been photographing for social media. Their homeowner's insurance carrier, informed of the fraudulent original certificate of occupancy as part of the county's public report, opened its own investigation and within 3 weeks formally denied any claim related to the structural defects, citing, in language Mara found almost unbearably satisfying to read in the denial letter Okafor later obtained through discovery, material misrepresentation regarding the code-compliant status of the insured structure at time of policy issuance. Lyle Draper's contractor's license was suspended pending a board investigation within the month, triggered directly by Curtis Boyle's sworn statement and corroborated by 3 additional former Draper employees who came forward once the first complaint became public record. Homeowners from other Draper projects, it turned out, had been quietly living with their own unexplained cracks for years too, and Mara's case gave them, for the first time, language and evidence to understand what they were looking at. Harold Kessler, faced with a civil complaint built on internal trust company emails, a forensic handwriting analysis, and a notary who could produce no journal record of ever witnessing the signature in question, did not fight the case to trial. His attorney, a general practice lawyer named Frank Delwood who typically handled property closings and had clearly never anticipated a case this cleanly documented, advised him within 6 weeks to settle. In January 2025, Harold agreed to a consent judgment, repayment of the full $192,000 principal, statutory interest calculated from the original 2019 transfer date, and attorney's fees, totaling $248,600, to be satisfied through liquidation of his remaining retirement accounts and a second mortgage on the family home, because there was, by that point, nowhere else the money could come from. Now that you've seen how far it went, was Mara Kessler justified in what she did? Did she go too far, or not far enough? Give me your verdict in the comments. The consequences that landed in the months that followed were not the loud, cinematic kind. They were the quiet, structural kind, which Mara understood better than anyone, are always the ones that hold. Renata and Bradley moved into a rented townhouse in February 2025, while Sterling Oaks Court sat empty, red tag still stapled to its door, its market value, once appraised at $2.1 million, reassessed by their own realtor at somewhere closer to $900,000, as a distressed, structurally compromised property that any buyer would have to gut and rebuild from the foundation up. They listed it in March at a loss neither of them could fully absorb, especially once the insurance denial made clear that no portion of the remediation cost would be covered. Bradley, according to what filtered back through extended family channels Mara no longer participated in, but occasionally still heard about, had started sleeping at his brother's place some nights. Whether that was about money or about the 4 years of shared certainty that had just been shown to be built on a lie, nobody in the family seemed able to say for sure. Harold's consent judgment gutted the retirement account he'd spent 30 years building, and the second mortgage on the house he and Denise had lived in for 26 years meant a monthly payment that visibly changed their lifestyle within a season. Denise, who had spent a decade calling Renata's mansion proof that hard work pays off, now found herself explaining to the same extended family group chat why her daughter's home had a red tag on the door and why she and Harold had suddenly downsized their annual beach trip. Nobody in that group chat asked Mara for photo updates on her own house anymore. They had, by then, seen the county's public inspection report and the civil court filing, both of which were a matter of public record that more than one relative had apparently gone looking for once the family whispers started. Lyle Draper's license suspension became a permanent revocation in the spring, following the board's finding that the pattern of soil non-compliance extended across at least 6 other properties. Roy Faulkner's name resurfaced briefly in a regional news piece about contractor fraud in fast-growing exurban developments, a piece that never mentioned the Kessler or Voss names directly, credited only to records obtained through a licensed engineer's public complaint, which was, Mara noted with something close to dry amusement, the closest thing to a byline she would ever get for 18 months of work. Mara used a portion of her settlement, the first real money she'd had access to in 8 years, to finally, properly renovate the bungalow on Larkspur Lane. New roof, first. Then the foundation crack in the north corner, professionally underpinned by a firm she trusted, closed and monitored until the gauges read stable for 6 straight months. She did not build a mansion. She built the modest, solid, well-maintained home she'd planned for back in 2016, before 8 years of stolen money and quiet mockery had gotten in the way. She did not speak to Harold for the better part of a year. She spoke to Denise exactly once, in the spring, a short phone call in which her mother, crying, asked how she could have done this to her own family, and Mara, sitting on the porch of a house with a roof that no longer leaked, said only that she hadn't done anything to the family that hadn't already been done to her first. She'd simply been the only one willing to prove it. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Was it worth it? Mara asked herself that question more than once, in the quiet months that followed, turning it over the way she used to turn over a suspect crack in a foundation, looking for the honest answer underneath the obvious one. The truth was that nothing about it felt like triumph, exactly. There was no parade, no dramatic reconciliation, no moment where her parents finally saw her clearly and apologized for 8 years of comparison. What there was, instead, was something quieter and more durable, a house that no longer leaked, a bank account that reflected what she'd actually been owed, and a family that could no longer pretend the daughter they'd mocked for having nothing had in fact been carrying the receipts the entire time. Mara had learned, across those 18 months, that some kinds of justice don't arrive with fireworks. They arrive the way a red tag arrives on a front door, quiet, official, and completely, permanently undeniable. If you've ever had to prove, patiently and on paper, that you were right about the people who dismissed you, or if you're still building that case right now, tell me about it in the comments. The vault is always open.